Hello and welcome to today's show of the LaRouche organization for Christmas Day, if you are in the Eastern Orthodox Church and in the eastern parts of the world, and also Epiphany, which was yesterday, January 6th, in the Western Christian Confession. Today's show is entitled The Epiphany of the 10 Principles, referring to the 10 principles for the creation of a new security and development architecture that have been enunciated by Helga LaRouche, the head of the Schiller Institute, and a wife of the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche. Now, today is a special occasion, and it's being celebrated in a special way because in the course of a fratricidal depopulation war in Europe, being fought for cynical geopolitical purposes in the name of something called the rule of law, a war that is walking us step by step to the nuclear annihilation of mankind, potentially. Russian President Vladimir Putin, following the request of Patriarch Kirill, head of the Russian Orthodox Church, declared a ceasefire in the special military operation beginning at noon on January 6th yesterday and ending tonight, midnight, Christmas Day, January 7th. So this acts as a simultaneous commemoration of the Western Epiphany, the traditional date at which 12 days after the birth of Christ, the Magi arrive, the three wise men arrive from the east to meet the Christ child. So it's the end of one season and the beginning of the other. Now that ceasefire had been rejected by Ukraine and NATO, but despite that, it's still the fulfillment of a kind of pre-Christmas campaign that was being conducted by thousands of clergy and laity alike in France, Germany, the United States, many other countries in the transatlantic sector, the NATO sector. And the idea was to fight for the principles of peace on earth and goodwill toward men in a time of adversity. We want you to recall that December 19th, the Schiller Institute issued a statement, one step away from the nuclear annihilation of mankind, a Christmas truce for all. And that included the promotion of an international musical campaign, for the performance of the composition Dona Nobis Pacem, which is included in what you're seeing there. And that's something that was done in the days between December 20th and December 25th and was continued and will be continued this weekend as well. And we think that this polyphonic composition, short canon, Dona Nobis Pacem, should become the kind of international anthem of the movement to stop war, acting in the same way as Martin Luther King's movement used the "We Shall Overcome" during the Civil Rights Movement. Now, in its fundamental objective, that action as a spiritual exercise has been proven to be successful. Now, the fact that it was denounced by Ukraine, by the United States government, and by some in NATO as being propaganda is a self-indictment because, after all, it's Christmas. Why does anyone have to assume that Christmas, someone saying, let's stop and honor that which comes from a higher purpose and which those of us who have that believe motivates the universe itself? Why has that got to be a geopolitical manipulation? Now, on the day of Epiphany, January 6th, it had been in past time a tradition to submerge oneself in ice water. You know, you see that with some of these polar bear things that everybody knows about, but that comes from the actual tradition of Epiphany. And the idea of that, of course, was to cleanse oneself at the beginning of the new year, but in the case of Epiphany, also to the realization of the salvation of the world being at hand. And perhaps that practice should be resumed by officials in the non-truce observing governments, because that or a similar systemic axiom-busting seismic shock probably has to be delivered to the brain, mind, and soul of these people who live in something they call democracies, which, of course, surveil all of their citizens. And they Twitter and they tweet and they flip and they flop. And people don't find themselves to have any real freedom of thought whatsoever. They look over their shoulder before they express what they call an opinion, and they can no longer defend truth as a result. Now, when you're looking at this kind of situation that the world finds itself in, which is a dire situation, we should make no bones about that. There's been a constant escalation going on day by day. The new weapon shipments that are coming from the United States and from Germany and from France into Ukraine, the mobilization that has been being done by Russia's forces, of course, on their border. It means that we are seeing something that people think is going to turn into a long war, but unfortunately, it could very well turn into a very, very short war for which we will get no notice. No pragmatic approach to politics is going to work at all in this situation. Only an approach using classical principles of poetry are going to really work. Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, who is a bit of a classicist himself, talks about the principle of metanoia, what some people will know as the Damascus Road conversion, as in the case of St. Paul. Where you have a kind of inversion of mindset. It's the kind of thing that we saw that President John F. Kennedy expressed after the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when he went to the United Nations in September of 1963 and proposed a joint mission to the moon for the United States and the Soviet Union. So that kind of shift, that kind of 180-degree epistemological bootlegger's turn, that's what's actually needed. But when you're talking to neocons and others, the illiterate, the morally illiterate, that's always very dubious. And then people become depressed and say, you can't make that happen. It isn't going to occur. Back in 2002, shortly after 9/11, Lyndon LaRouche, the late economist and statesman, gave an interview to an Egyptian journalist in which he took up this question of pessimism and the issue of the change in mindset and how one does that with a population which finds itself too little to think.
The key thing in any situation, the crisis situation, from my knowledge of history, is what the crucial factor is leadership which addresses the crucial issues. And if you can do that, at least you're giving the people a reason for optimism. And if you can give them a reason for optimism, which is justified, they often will respond. And you have to be patient with the people.
If I'm American,
Exactly.
Now, forget about Virginia, because we are now talking to the people all around the states. Some, like in Michigan, there are about 1 million, everywhere else. What is your advice to me to act immediately to reflect my negative opinion toward what's going on against the
Well,
minority?
I would always say the optimistic side is the most effective way. When people are being depressed, to try to depress them more doesn't work. It's negative. So you must not be essentially negative. You can say, this stinks, clear. This is wrong. I think you know what the anger is of people abroad, of what's happening from here. How is it, explain to me, how is it that a country with this history, the history of Franklin Roosevelt and so forth, could get to this state where they would allow this to go on? What is happening in your politics that allows you to tolerate this? Why don't you change your politics? And because the idea that there is an alternative is what's important. And when someone from
I'm
abroad...
asking about alternatives.
Yeah, would you say...
If there are only Democrat and Republican, where those people can go?
Well, that's the point. But we always fight inside these parties as well. It's the people of the people. The parties do not own the people. Most of the majority of the people in the United States today who could vote do not like either party. They don't trust them. They might vote for one party, but only because they're voting against the other.
Exactly. This is my point.
They don't believe in it. So the problem is their pessimism, their lack of sense of organization, the lack of discussion of ideas. The news media, the entertainment media, which suppress all important ideas. We're in a cultural desert here. You must watch this crazy news media, entertainment media.
They're all biased. I mean,
it's ugly. And you can imagine a people which is spending so much of its leisure time entrapped with obsession with mass news media, the mass entertainment media. What's the moral effect on them? They're depressed. They're demoralized. They've lost their sense. Then you look at the schools. The educational system in our school system stinks. You would not graduate, a college graduate of today would not be qualified to graduate from a secondary school 25 years, 30 years ago. So you have an ignorant population, a population which used to be a producing society, is now a consumer society. It doesn't produce anymore. We get from foreign countries some cheap labor. We extract credit from foreign countries to buy their goods of cheap labor. We live on credit. We don't produce.
Exactly.
That's our problem. We are actually a decadent society, but with a historical potential embedded in us from previous generations, which, if we can awaken it, can do some because we are power. If we decide to do something good as the United States, we can tilt the balance in the world to make something good happen. Like if the United States decided this mess in the Middle East is going to stop, it would stop. We have enough power to bring that about, not necessarily directly, but by our shifting our influence. And our concern is always to give a people a sense of optimism of what they can do with their lives. The problem is largely a moral one. The average American today does not think as they used to think 35 years ago. They've lost it. You have two generations who don't think the same way. The older generation would have thought in terms of coming generations. What am I doing for my family, my grandchildren generation? What am I doing for my nation? A person would sacrifice in order to give a better education for the children of a community, would sacrifice to build this, build that, from which they would not directly benefit, to have something better for their community. Like large projects, like this big thing in Egypt, this project of the new cities project for the imagine something which would take 5 to 10 years to become functional in every case.
Like Alexandria Library.
Yeah. So that it's necessary. So people in Egypt would, I've talked with many of them who were involved in this. Is an image of the future of Egypt, of the Nile system of Africa, based on Egypt's traditional connection to Asia and to all of Africa. An image where people were willing to devote their lives and take pride as professor this or something that or bureaucrat this, in a sense that they were devoting their life to this purpose, which is good, enjoyable work, in the sense it had a good purpose, but they were thinking about what kind of a future they're building. They could die with a smile on their face because they had given their life to something that meant something. Their life had not been wasted. In the Americans today, you don't have that sense. It still exists in every human being, potentially. A sense of, you say, what happens when you die? Well, I'm worried about what I get now. That's your American response. What I get next week. I'm not going to think about tomorrow. I don't want to think about the community. I don't want to think about the nation, the world. I want to think about what I'm getting next week. And therefore, a population which is indoctrinated with that, the pleasure-seeking population, like the corruption of ancient Rome under Nero and civil emperors, where they would march into the Colosseum for mass spectator sports, people killing each other, mass spectator sports.
Yeah.
And they were controlled by that. We have a similar phenomenon in the United States, a romantic phenomenon of a useless population, like Rome was living on grain taken from North Africa and from what is now called France, sitting there as parasites amid vast slavery and the most decadent and corrupt and disgusting mass of ruling strata you can imagine.
I can imagine how the hope is anyhow nearby somewhere in America.
Well, what I'm saying, I just said to you, I'm saying as an optimist. I'm optimistic about human beings, about the potential which lies in virtually every human being. And I think that with a certain amount of wisdom, we can devise ways to evoke that from them. But the first thing is what we have to be ourselves. To be an effective leader, you must be irreproachable in your commitment to that purpose. Because if you're false in any respect, the people will smell you out and they won't believe you.
Do you believe some people are still running after you, trying to block you to access the...
I probably
I just remind that Susan just told me regarding they tried to kill you. And,
Sure, several times. The U.S. government tried to kill me.
You have the feeling.
No, I know
same
it.
Here.
I know it, but it's also more complicated because, again, I'm an institutional person at this point. I'm an institution of the United States, and the institutions of the United States have been killed. They've been crushed and imprisoned and so forth and whatnot. But an institution has an institutional figure has a certain protection that the others don't. But they're afraid of me. The American Tory faction hates me and they're afraid of me. But they have a problem, is that what I represent in the United States does have a broad base, historical base, which is embedded in the people, in the culture. My friendship with countries in the Americas, in Central and South America, is well known. My friendship with countries such as Egypt, or my friendship with leading Russians today, my friendships in Europe, and so forth. My attachment to the cause, or almost hopeless cause of sub-Saharan Africa, is well known. So I'm an institutional figure. And many people in the United States respect me. They may not agree with me, but they respect me.
So we do, Mr. LaRouche.
As you go on, life is short. What you accomplish with your life is what's really important. It can be shortened at any time. Don't worry about it. Just go on and do what you have to do. Be cautious. Don't be indiscreet. Don't be stupid. But don't gamble for perfect solutions. They don't exist.
Thank you, Mr. LaRouche,
Thank you.
to have you here with us.
If you've just joined us, welcome to our show, the LaRouche Organization show for today, 2023, the Epiphany of the 10 Principles. And you've just heard the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche from a discussion that he had with an Egyptian reporter in 2002, 20 years ago. Now, the Epiphany of the 10 Principles refers to the principles for a new security and development architecture, which is a proposal made by Helga Sepp LaRouche for how to negotiate a new form of a world development process. The first and the idea of this is that you have to have the idea of how humanity would experience a new dispensation, you could call it actually, a new birth of freedom in which people will leave behind the past, not because they forget the past, but because they walk away from the past. And learning and practicing the poetic principle of epiphany in the face of adversity is the subject of today's Manhattan Project discussion. That's what Lyndon LaRouche was just going through, talking about how you deal with the problem of the pessimism in a population. Now, at the beginning of that document on the 10 principles for a new security and development architecture, Helga Sepp LaRouche, who's the author of the document, says, the new paradigm which will be characteristic of the new epoch and towards which the new global security and development architecture must be directed, therefore, must eliminate the concept of oligarchism for good and proceed to organize the political order in such a way that the true character of humanity as the creative species can be realized. Therefore, I suggest the following principles. And that's how the document begins. Now, that might lead one in the face of what we opened this broadcast saying about the danger of nuclear war, the fact that you have people continually escalating, the fact that Ukraine and the United States and NATO did not accept the ceasefire that was being conducted and was proposed and decreed by Vladimir Putin and by the Russian Orthodox Church, in line with what had been an ecumenical proposal for the same thing from the Vatican and from other independent churches, Protestant, otherwise, globally. The fact that people don't respond to these things is, of course, then said to justify all sorts of policies and actions, often actions of revenge, essentially, which Sophocles and other and Aeschylus and other writers of Greek tragedy made clear never actually ultimately gets you anywhere. Shakespeare's War of the Roses series shows us the same thing. And due to the illiteracy of popular entertainment, these things are never presented as the tragedies they are, such as the tragedy of Henry V, which is always sort of presented these days as some form of actually British as opposed to English triumphalism, rather than the tragedy that it actually represents from the beginning of the play, very clearly in the role of the clergy in manipulating the young Henry. So therefore, people argue there's not a way to really do the right thing. And it's also the case that people wish to believe that if you take the other approach, which is I'm going to be optimistic, it means let's simply not look at the brutal realities of what we are dealing with. That's not what Helga Sepp-LaRouche does. And what we wanted to do here is to share a part of a discussion that she conducted with Harley Schlanger, from whom you'll hear in just a moment, just a few days ago, concerning particularly the circumstance in Germany. I also want to point out that this Tuesday, Helga is holding a discussion which is called "What About International Law, Mrs. Merkel?" Referring to something that is actually well described in the video. And so I'm going to let the video speak for itself.
Helga, one of the things that came out in the last weeks of 2022 was the confirmation from Merkel and then from former French President Hollande that the Minsk Accords were never intended to be a policy of peace and reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia, but a time to allow for the buildup of the Ukrainian military. In other words, they were committed to a war against Russia going back to 2014. What are the implications of that in terms of the broader diplomatic situation?
Well, first of all, I'm sure that this subject will be a matter of discussion among many countries and many think tanks and politicians and concerned people, because the implication of that is really huge. Because, you know, this was not just lying about the intention, but, you know, there was actually a UN resolution 2202, which basically made the agreement of the Minsk Agreement, international law. And by admitting that they couldn't care less about that, Merkel and Hollande, they basically say, you know, we don't care about people's law. It doesn't matter to us. And this, you know, after the United States has already demonstrated that many times by, you know, not sticking to UN resolutions concerning wars, of interventionist wars and all kinds of things. We saw the lying in the case of Libya, for example, where they lied to the UN Security Council. So this is an erosion of international law. And that comes from those people who are, you know, taking a mouthful every 2 minutes about the rules-based order. Now that clearly shows that the rules-based order is in complete violation and contradiction to international law. That's not new, but it's an incredible, scandalous confirmation. Now, Merkel, you know, I mean, I must say, I never thought highly of her because I always thought she was mediocre. But this is really even going beyond that. And, you know, in the case of Hollande, I think he has deserved now the nickname, the Lying Dutchman. This is a pun on Hollande, which, you know, means also Holland, you know, the Dutch, the Netherlands, and the opera, the Flying Dutchman in German is the Fliegende Holländer, which you can now change into the Lügende Holländer, and I think in French it works as well. So I would hope that a lot of people repeat that to make it stick. Because it's actually, you know, ironic, but also very, very important that people always remind themselves about the lying character of the so-called Western leaders. Now, the implication of that is really incredible, because if you think about it, and I actually looked it up, I looked up in put in some search machines and looked Minsk Accord, sanctions, and for years, all kinds of politicians were always saying, that the sanctions against Russia can only be lifted after the full implementation of the Minsk Accord. And, you can be sure if Merkel and Hollande were saying that, and Poroshenko, I mean, Putin was the only one in that quartet who, obviously did believe that they meant it seriously. But, that means that they were all the time, the entire EU leadership was lying all the time about when they said the sanctions can only be lifted after the Minsk Accord is implemented, while they were arming the Ukrainian for a coming war, and only Putin was patient. Now, I think that whole thing needs to be discussed and reflected upon, because it does take apart the story about that Russia committed this war in an unprovoked fashion, a war of aggression, unprovoked. Obviously, this was built up for a very long time. And, it does fit. If you look at these 9 packages of sanctions, actually, I looked them all up, and it's step by step, more strangulation of the economy. And that was the plan from the time go, probably before the Maidan coup, which Nuland, was famous in saying, that the State Department had spent $5 billion on preparing color revolutions. So, the aim from the beginning obviously was to, as Baerbock is saying repeatedly, to ruin Russia. And that was even repeated by these 2 unnamed White House officials on the 25th of February a year ago, that is before the so-called war of aggression started, where these 2 unnamed White House officials said that the aim is to cut Russia off any ability to diversify from oil and gas, to deny them any modern technology. And basically, that already was incredible, because how are you authorized to say that you want to prevent another country from their right to development? So the whole thing is really becoming very, very transparent. But, the implication of it is severe, because now the Russians are saying, like Foreign Minister Lavrov is saying, that they will do no more any project together with the EU, because the trust has been completely destroyed. And, that, is something which will be very, very difficult to repair, because, this is really a treason, a betrayal over 8 years. So I think the implication of that is incredibly, and I would really hope that a lot of people who are concerned about the condition of the world would engage in a discussion about what that implies about the values of the West.
So again, if you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's LaRouche Organization webcast. And the theme is 2023, the Epiphany of the 10 Principles. That was just Helga Sepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute and the author of the 10 Principles for a New Security and Development Architecture. She will be keynoting a forum this coming Tuesday called What About International Law, Mrs. Merkel? And you can find information about that up on the Schiller Institute website. We have it there. It's a live conference, as you can see, starting at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And you have a list there of the speakers, which will include Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, co-founder of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, also Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector, and Helga. So that's for you for this coming Tuesday. Much was said there by Helga, and we want to now go to Harley Schlanger, who is the person moderating and interviewing her that you just saw in that interview. Just want to point out something as we go to Harley, just to put it into the discussion. and that is the remarks that were just recently made by Jens Stoltenberg from NATO, who said, if we want to have a negotiated peace solution where Ukraine survives as an independent democratic party in Europe, the fastest way to get there is to support Ukraine. Weapons are, in fact, the way to peace. Some of us know that as the old war is peace in the form of George Orwell's 1984. Some of you remember that slogan. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, was the entirety of it. So Harley, with that introduction, we'll come back to the rest of that quotation later. Welcome to 2023. What do you have to say to us?
Well, as this is the first Manhattan Project meeting we've had in 2023, let me begin by wishing a happy new year to everyone. And I don't mean that as some kind of symbolic statement, but we have a mission. And our mission is to make sure that 2023 is a good year filled with joy and happiness for mankind. And the question we're addressing today is, will we see 2023 as the year of the new paradigm? And as you were discussing, and Helga also, the world has been trapped in this paradigm of the post-Cold War, neoconservative, permanent warfare, and permanent austerity policy. And this is the policy of the City of London. It's a policy of a global corporate oligarchy. And its natural direction is toward war and chaos and depopulation. It's a Malthusian, a deliberate Malthusian policy. Now, what's important, though, as Lynn talked about this question of optimism, is that even as this drive is continuing, as we see in the delusional quote from Stoltenberg, there is a second paradigm moving in an opposite and different direction than the paradigm of the neoconservative, neoliberal order. The dynamic between them right now is toward a permanent war, possibly a nuclear war. So what we want to do is start by reviewing a couple of the leading developments in this, and then take up a couple of particulars for the discussion. So let's start by looking at what is the Anglo-American or the unipolar paradigm. Well, as we see from Stoltenberg, we see from Biden, we see from Sunak in Great Britain, we see in the decision made by the Germans and the French to send more weapons, that there is a continuation of and a reassertion of war as the policy from the West. While they're asserting that the war is the result of Russian aggression, the real war is coming from NATO, as it has been since at least 2014, when the coup was carried out by Western forces, including the personal role played by Obama, Joe Biden, and Victoria Nuland in bringing about the regime change coup in Ukraine. They've been continuing this, and now, not surprisingly, we see a reemergence of some of the most bloodthirsty neocons coming out in the last couple of days. On January 2nd, for example, one of the leading war hawks in the United States, John Bolton, had an op-ed in the Daily Telegraph. And what Bolton said in that op-ed is that the policy of the West must be global NATO. And he cited an early 2000 document by Jose Maria Aznar, at the time the president or prime minister of Spain, who called for an expansion of NATO into Asia, bringing in other countries such as Japan, Australia, Singapore. And we're seeing that drive going on right now. And Bolton said that's absolutely necessary to continue not just the Ukraine war, but to expand NATO. Bolton, by the way, I think it was yesterday, on British television, announced his candidacy for the U.S. presidency. Think it's interesting, don't you, that he would do it on British television? I don't think he's done it yet in the U.S. And besides Bolton, there was another character who may be known to some of you, and unfortunately people forget these guys. This is an especially bloated figure named Robert Kagan, one of the early neoconservatives, although he describes himself as a liberal defender of the liberal order. Kagan was involved in PNAC, the program for Project for a New American Century, which was the grouping that ran the Bush-Cheney war after 9/11. Kagan is sometimes called a neocon or a neoliberal or a neo-imperialist. But as I said, he styles himself as a defender of liberal hegemony. It's worth noting that his wife is Victoria Nuland, another prominent neocon, and Nuland, in fact, was there with Obama and Biden and the neo-Nazis in Maidan Square conducting the 2014 coup as a top aide to Hillary Clinton. And interestingly, Kagan, who is styled in the media as a conservative, was close friends with Hillary Clinton, served on one of her foreign policy discussion groups, and Nuland was a top assistant to Hillary Clinton. So this idea of left-right is something that we have to throw out when we're looking at this Anglo-American imperial order. Now, we also have, not surprisingly, one of the leading Anglo-American think tanks, the Atlantic Council, will be sponsoring a seminar, I believe the same day that we're having our seminar on Merkel. They're having a seminar on what will it take to regain Crimea. So they're continuing to insist that Ukraine get the arms and weapons and everything else it needs to seize back Crimea, despite the fact that when there was a vote in Crimea as to which direction the people of Crimea wanted to go, there's about a 90% participation and about a 90% pro-Russia vote. Now, in addition to the Ukraine situation, there's a continuation of the tough talk against China. And this is coming from people in the Congress, it's coming from the media. It comes, interestingly, around Taiwan in particular, the need for independence from Taiwan, but maybe they forgot that about a month ago there was a vote in Taiwan and the pro-independence party was shellacked, was defeated thoroughly by a party which stands for the continuation of the relationship between Taiwan and China. But that's not going to stop the talk about this, and they're continuing with the AUKUS project. They're continuing with a major proposal to rearm Japan. The Japanese are going to double their defense budget in the next 5 years to become one of the largest armies in the world. And this is something that was praised, by the way, by both Bolton and Kagan. Now, we also have in the United States a defense budget which is somewhere over $800 billion and growing, with every day almost new money tacked on for weapons for Ukraine, and the pledge for more weapons, the insistence that the Germans have to provide more sophisticated weaponry. The French are providing a Patriot battery for the air defense and so on. So you have a continued commitment to this kind of massive war buildup, which is not just related to Ukraine, although that's the immediate excuse, but the U.S. is moving to create more bases in Africa, more confrontation in Asia, and we also see now Jacobin revolts taking place in Peru and Bolivia as the neo-fascist movements are overthrowing the governments there. And this is something to keep an eye on because the other targets include Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, 3 countries which are part of the orientation toward the BRICS and China. Now, finally, let me just mention the continuation of economic problems in the West, high inflation, the Baltic states, the tough-talking Baltic states. I think they're 18 to 22% inflation there. Europe as a whole remains close to 9 to 10% inflation. The great global gateway project, which was Europe's counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative, well, in the European Commission this last week, there were admissions that, number 1, the money's not there, number 2, the plans are not there, and number 3, there's no enthusiasm for it. But there is enthusiasm for something different. The global gateway is seen as a public relations stunt, just as Biden's Build Back Better policy is seen as a public relations stunt. But in reality, it's not just a public relations stunt. In both cases, it's an anti-development push to stop development in the former colonial sector. Now, what we're seeing instead in the non-unipolar world is real diplomacy, moves toward the new paradigm, this new security and development architecture. I'll just mention a couple. One of the most prominent was a video conference between Presidents Putin and Xi Jinping, which took place right at the beginning of the year. What's interesting about it is the media is filled with stories now, and especially from the think tanks, that Russia is isolated, Russia is weak, it's being defeated by Ukraine. The reason there's not much fighting going on is that their army's demoralized, Putin is isolated, and so on. Well, in fact, that's more of the hybrid warfare, which is a fancy word for lying, that you're getting in the Western press. What Putin said in his discussion with Xi Jinping is quite interesting. He said, we, meaning Russia, are defending not only our own interests, but those of all who stand for a truly democratic world order and the right of countries freely to determine their own destiny, unquote. That's what the former colonial sector has been wanting since the end of colonialism beginning after World War II. Not just freedom on paper, but the capability to develop their nation as sovereign nations to take care of the needs of their people. That's something that the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the offshore banking system, and so on has never intended. Instead, it sees those countries as sources of cheap labor and cheap raw materials, and the growing populations in those countries not as a benefit for mankind, but as something that must be overturned and reversed. So when Putin says we stand for the right of countries freely to determine their own destiny, that's why the global South as a whole is not supporting the sanctions against Russia and is not lining up behind the war hawks in the West. Xi Jinping, in his response to that, said we're at a historic crossroad. We can either revert to a Cold War mentality, provoke division and antagonism, and stoke confrontation, in other words, geopolitics, or, he said, to act out of the common good of humanity, promote mutual respect, and a win-win cooperation. And he said, this is the challenge that is, quote, testing the wisdom of statesmen in major countries. He could have added, finding that, unfortunately, there's not much wisdom coming from the Western world. Now, just two other examples of what's going on. Again, much of this is not covered in the Western press, and if it is, it's covered in a blurb here and there and treated as almost unimportant. But we have an extremely significant development between Turkey and Syria. A rapprochement taking place, the possibility of an Erdogan-Assad summit, and Turkey moving its troops out, accepting Syrian sovereignty over the territory, which becomes very interesting because what country in the world which talks about sovereignty is not recognizing Syrian sovereignty? It's the United States. The United States has troops in Syria, not just in Syria, but in the oil fields of Syria and in the best grain-producing areas of Syria. Now, what's especially interesting about the Erdogan-Assad rapprochement is the role that Putin is playing. Not NATO, not the EU, not the United States, which, by the way, was supporting the so-called moderate rebels who were really bloodthirsty terrorists, but Russia, which came in to protect Syria, to support Syrian sovereignty against these terrorists, and now Russia is mediating the Turkey-Syria relationship. And one other development is Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the president of the Philippines, went to China. There's an attempt, as we've been talking, to stir up the China situation, including the Philippines around the South China Sea. There's been tension there, but they had a couple of days of good meetings, billions of dollars worth of economic agreements signed, discussion about avoiding military confrontation, and this is the step in the right direction. Now, Dennis already mentioned Putin's Christmas truce proposal, rejected by Zelensky, not just rejected by Zelensky, but Zelensky is closing down the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And this is a church which goes back to the very beginnings of the history of Ukraine as a nation. It's had a historic alliance with Russia. In fact, it was from this church you had Kievan Rus, the original development of Russia. The leadership of the church, under pressure, rejected the Russian special military operation, but even so, Zelensky shut it down and would not allow members of the church to participate at their cathedral in Christmas services. That's the state of Ukraine, the great democracy of Ukraine that's being defended by your tax dollars and maybe even your soldiers and special forces. So that's the fight between the two paradigms right now, just a summary of some developments. Let me bring up some other leading developments that we should discuss on the program today. First, as you heard from Helga, the Minsk betrayal and what the admissions of Merkel and Hollande mean. As Helga pointed out, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has said, who can we negotiate with? If we negotiate with people that are known liars, how can we trust them? Now, this is crucial because behind me is a book called Moscow Rules, which essentially is used very extensively by people in the think tanks, the British-run think tanks that shape policy. And one of the themes of the book is that Russia is paranoid. The Russian national character, almost genetically paranoid about the West, assuming you can't trust the West, that the West is out to get them, and that this is a continual problem that the West has to deal with. Well, I wonder if this guy is going to change his thinking now that it becomes clear that maybe the West is untrustworthy. You know, they say you're not paranoid if someone's out to get you. And in this case, as we can document from the period of the end of the Cold War, Russia has been lied to. There's been a constant attempt to undercut it, to take away support for Russia in the Russian near abroad, to run color regime change coups, including funding a so-called opposition inside Russia and so on. So what does it mean that Merkel and Hollande admit that they had no intention of following through on the peace agreement that they were supposed to guarantee between Ukraine and the people in the eastern territory of Ukraine, the Donbas region? So that's something we should discuss more. Secondly, the broader implications of what's come out with the Twitter files and the reporting on this, especially by Matt Taibbi. If you look at it day by day, there's little bits and pieces that get out, and they basically say, well, Twitter was not so good, but it's being built up a mountain out of a molehill. You had the FBI coming out saying that this is the job of conspiracy theorists to slander the FBI and so on. But actually, when you look at it as a whole, what do you see? Simple point. It was not Russia that interfered in the 2016 US election, in the Brexit election, in the French elections. It was the US intelligence agencies. And people who say, well, Twitter is not really a First Amendment issue because Twitter's not the government, and the First Amendment applies only to prohibitions against the government, not abridging free speech and free press. Well, now we find that the government was the one pressuring Twitter to ban people, not just the government, but even people like the hapless idiot Adam Schiff, who is the head of the Intelligence Committee, who went to Twitter and asked them to ban a reporter because he didn't like that reporter's reporting on what he was doing. So the broader implications of the Twitter files are something we should discuss because it's something that can be used to give people a deeper understanding that it's not just bad guys who are trying to suppress free speech, it's that there's a deliberate, coordinated effort run out of the intelligence agencies of the Five Eyes countries, especially out of the British and US, CIA, FBI, and so on, to disorient you, to confuse you, to prevent you from actually figuring out what is in the real interests of the United States. Now, a third issue is the reemergence of the discussion of the importance of declassifying the JFK files. I'm sure you've heard Dennis and some of the recent programs discussing this. This is really important because what happened in 1963 changed the direction of the United States, not just because we lost a president, but because we submitted to a cover-up which we should have known, and in fact many people did know, was carried out by the intelligence agencies that were running an assassination bureau that not just killed John F. Kennedy, but killed Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, killed Enrico Mattei, a very prominent Italian industrialist, and continued to run terror operations up through the present day, including assassinations, including the targeting of Lyndon LaRouche. So the importance of getting to the bottom of the JFK, not just the assassination, but the cover-up, is something that we can discuss. Now, I want to just close by saying what we should do in this discussion, and I encourage you to send in your questions and your thoughts on it, is that these are matters that are confusing to most citizens. They seem too complex to grasp, or they're taken as victims. Oh yeah, it's all this bad stuff that's being done against us. Instead, we have to realize that the people who are living in this Anglo-American la-la land, many of them know it's not real. Many of them know they're suffering because of these lies and corruption, but they don't see a way out. And we have to help people break from their delusions that all is fine, and we can use some of these issues to do this. Let me just throw one other thing out, which I find particularly fascinating, which is while many people are focused on the Prince Harry and Meghan Markle soap opera, in his book, he laid out something that's really quite interesting. As a pilot, a helicopter pilot in Afghanistan, if he's telling the truth, he said that he shot 25 Afghan Taliban. And he said, in order to do this in warfare, you have to have an attitude that these are not people, but they're like chess pieces. Well, we're told that Prince Harry is one of the woke members of the British royal family who's aware of racism and is fighting it. Apparently, he was a typical British imperial racist in his approach to warfare, as was pointed out by, of all people, a Taliban spokesman who said these were not chess pieces, these were real people you were shooting and killing who had wives and children waiting for them at home. So I think these are some things we can discuss. My basic point is that this is a war that's underway that's not something outside of your life. It's something that's directly affecting you in everything you do, how you think, and that's the way our enemies approach it. They're doing everything they can to change how people think about important issues. That's what pre-bunking is all about. That's what this whole idea of hybrid warfare, of controlling the narrative, is to control the way your mind works to either cause you to block things out or to think differently so that you lose touch with the broader human mission that we're all celebrating in the Christmas period. So I think it's important, if you have some thoughts and ideas on this, some questions, get them into us today. We'll post the schedule of all the events coming up because there are 3 or 4 events coming up, including an important one on January 15th on the MLK birthday celebration day. So let's get the discussion started.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Harley. And before we go to questions, we just want to acknowledge something that the Schiller Institute has commemorated and memorialized ever since it occurred, and that is the tragic death of many members of the Alexandrov Chorus and Ensemble in a plane crash on December 25th of 2016. Back at that time, it was a jetliner which took off from the Russian Defense Ministry. It crashed into the Black Sea. It was taking off from Sochi International Airport and was on its way to Syria for a concert. And we extend our condolences to all of the families and friends of those members, as well as our gratitude for their steadfast support of the people of New York City. This was particularly expressed at the 10th anniversary of 9/11, in particular musical celebration which occurred involving the policemen and firemen of New York who have a chorus. And the Alexandrov Ensemble members sang "God Bless America" in honor of the slain policemen, firefighters, and citizens killed that day. And in fact, the soloist of that occasion was one of the people killed in the plane crash of December 25th, 2016. What we're going to do is we're going to play you the beginning of our December 2021 ceremony of commemoration, which was held at what is sometimes called the Teardrop Memorial, but its proper name is To the Struggle Against World Terrorism. This was a memorial dedicated to the people of the United States by the Russian government back in 2005. It stands in Bayonne, New Jersey, and the ceremony occurred there. And so we're going to show you the opening of that.
Welcome. My name is Randy Geis. I'm a captain with the Bayonne Fire Department. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us during this ceremony of remembrance as we stand here today in the shadow of the 20th anniversary of September 11th. Behind us is a reminder of not only the loss we suffered during September 11th, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and today the reason why we gather to 2016 tragic Christmas Day plane crash that claimed the lives of 92 passengers and crew, including 64 members of the Alexandrov Ensemble Choir of the Russian Armed Forces. More so, this is a reminder, and I quote, that our common humanity is far, far more important than our differences we have. In 2006, Bill Clinton said that when he dedicated this monument that is erected behind us. At this time, I'd like to introduce Reverend Patterson for our invocation.
Good morning and thank you. Let us all bring our wandering minds to a place where there might be peace and unity. Let us pray. Creator God, in your infinite wisdom, you created all people in your male day, in the very image of who you are, without exception to color, language, education, economic status, or where we live. We are all living human documents, all your daughters and sons, all sisters and brothers. Open our eyes to see the worth of every human being and open our hearts to forgive and repent of any act that does not please you, as you are a God of love. Oh God, we give thanks for your love. Today we remember the Red Army Choir and all 92 of those who boarded the Tu-154 plane from Russia and died in the Black Sea 5 years ago, on their way to serve others through the many gifts you bestowed upon them. Oh God, we give thanks for your service. Today we remember those who lost their lives in the 9/11 attacks in the nation, in this particular nation, people going about their everyday lives, and people who ran into danger to save those in danger. Oh God, we give thanks for their service. We stand today in solidarity as gap dwellers, closing the gap on injustices of all kinds, using our voices to sing, to be the voice for the voiceless, to be visible for those society has made invisible, to sound the trumpet for love together. Oh God, strengthen those who stand in the gap. Enlighten, empower, encourage them as they engage others to eliminate the gap of inequity and equality, to birth healing in your creation. God, bless your creation. Amen. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend. And at this time, I'd like to invite Our Excellence, Ambassador Dmitry Kumachov, Deputy Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation Mission to the United Nations, up to make a statement.
Thank you very much for joining us today. We have come to honor the memory of the victims of a plane crash that took place in the skies of over the Russian city of Sochi in December 2016. On that Christmas day, the world lost almost all members of the Alexandrov ensemble. Outstanding philanthropist Elizaveta Glinka, journalists from Russian mass media, and the crew, nearly 100 passengers of the flight who were heading to Syria to organize a charity event. This tragedy resonates in the hearts and minds of people throughout the globe. Our symbolic ceremony that is held on the American soil is another proof of that. What it shows is that human relations and friendly ties between Russians and Americans are indissoluble. We could make sure that in September this year, when we have gathered at this very spot by the Teardrop Memorial to commemorate the victims of 9/11. Amidst the very complicated international situation, it is the humanitarian ties that bring us together strongly. Russia has always stood for enhancing such contacts. Even today, with COVID-19 and with the new surge, cultural people-to-people contacts do not stop, they even grow larger and stronger. In a sense, they intensify because we learned one thing from the pandemic: it is indefinitely new ways and forms of communications. Our words of gratitude go to the Schiller Institute and the fire department of the city of Bayonne, who for many years have been co-organizers of these memorial events. Your contribution to the friendship and solidarity between the peoples of Russia and the United States, of our two countries, cannot be overestimated, and we really look forward to the times that we do not wait for the strategic events unite us, but that we are united without them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so Harley, we have a few questions now, and by the way, we should place up on the underneath so people know that where they can write to ask questions. So this one is from the chat, and the question is, why doesn't NATO make a peace deal with Putin? Do they really think that they will defeat Russia? That's the question. And there's a second question which I'll put with that because it's along the same line, from Munasha, who is asking, what could be the outcome of the Russian-Ukraine war?
Well, the second one, the most dangerous outcome could be nuclear war, or if not nuclear war, full-scale war between NATO and Russia, in which most experts acknowledge that it would be a catastrophe for Europe as well as for Russia, and likely a trigger for nuclear war. So that's one outcome. The other outcome is the one that we're fighting for. And this gets to the first question: what do the people in NATO think? You know, this is where it's hard to get into the mind of them, but if you listen to people like Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, or the various defense and ministers of European countries, including in the United States, Lloyd Austin, the people like Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister. You look at what Boris Johnson's role was, what his short-term replacement said, Liz Truss, about being prepared to launch nuclear war. You have to ask yourself, do they really think about what they're doing? Do they really think it's a wise strategy to conduct a war against a major nuclear power using the people of Ukraine as cannon fodder? And you might also ask yourself, what do the people of Ukraine think? You know, supposedly they're valiantly standing up against the Russian barbarians. But what we're seeing is the slaughter of their army. And the only reason the war is continuing is money is coming in. So the simple answer that people have, and there's some truth to it, but it's not nearly the whole truth, is that the arms manufacturers, the consulting firms, and so on that are involved in war want war. You know, as Smedley Butler said, war is a racket. You know, people make money. But that's not the answer. The answer is that you actually have a grouping at the top that pulls the strings of the governments of the NATO countries and the European Union countries and the United States, a group of corporate cartel officials, people who, many of them have prominent names in the old days, the Rockefellers and the Morgans and the DuPonts. But it's broader than that. It's, you know, where does someone like Lloyd Austin come from? He became defense secretary after a military career landed him a post at Raytheon, one of the 5 major U.S. defense contractors. But what did he say is the purpose of this war? It's to weaken Russia, to defeat Russia. And what I would say is that the NATO officials pushing this war actually believe that Russia represents a threat to them. Not just a military threat, but the ones who pull the strings, I should say, at the top, recognize that the move toward a new paradigm is an existential crisis for them. And this brings us to the issue of geopolitics. You know, people use the term geopolitics as though it's just a synonym for strategic policy. No, geopolitics was a specific outlook developed by people who believe in the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. You look at the people who supported Mackinder. You look at the universities that they teach at. You look at the corporations that are involved, going back to Cecil Rhodes and so on. You look at the outlook of Winston Churchill. You look at the brutality of the British Empire. And we're being brainwashed today to think the British Empire was actually a civilizing force in the world. But millions of Indians died because of the policies of the British Empire. Large numbers of Irish died because of the policies of the British Empire. And what are their policies? They're characterized by the outlook of the Malthusians that there are too many people on the planet, there's not enough raw materials to go around, and the wealthy aren't going to give up their share, so you have to reduce the population. And if Russia and China are going to stand against that policy, and that policy is a policy of limited sovereignty or no sovereignty, that no nation has the right to step outside the rules-based order. You've heard that from Blinken. You've heard it from Biden. You've heard it from Trump. You've heard it from Obama. And you've heard it from all the European politicians. The rules must stand. They must be enforced. And this is what the reason I brought up Robert Kagan is that Kagan actually says this is the best way to do business in the world. And that's the view of the neocons, that American democracy, and by what they mean by democracy is free trade, privatization, the benefits to the most wealthy, which will then trickle down to everyone else, that this is the best of all possible worlds. And Russia stands in the way of it. So the intention of NATO is to prevent once and for all a Russian intervention against the establishment of a global so-called rules-based order or unipolar order. And that's why they're also fighting China. That's why the Russia-China alliance is so important. And it's also why there's a battle going on in countries like India and Brazil and South Africa, where the Anglo-American forces are trying to overthrow the governments which are refusing to join their war against Russia and China. And we see the same thing happening throughout Africa and South America and Asia. So this is the nature of the war. And whether you know it or not, it's a war over this idea that there are too many people and that we need means of reducing the so-called surplus population, or what the Nazis called the useless eaters. And I don't think you would have someone like Tony Blinken ever say that in public, but that's what his policies represent. And whether he knows it or not, there are people who know it. People like King Charles, who's openly stated in the past that the world should have fewer people. Prince Philip, his father, said the world should have less than 1 billion people. So I would say that's the mentality behind the NATO war hawks, and they intend to fight this until they defeat Russia. And I think it's going to be impossible for them to defeat Russia without forcing an escalation which could lead to a nuclear war. So we'd better take our mission seriously of taking power out of the hands of this ruling oligarchy.
Okay, Harley, we have something we want you to respond to, which is a statement or a discussion by Scott Bennett. Scott Bennett is a veteran of the 11th Psychological Operations Battalion of the U.S. Army, a former State Department counterterrorism analyst, and he said this week. We're going to put it up on the screen so people can read along. There seems to be a concerted effort to weaken Germany out of a fear of Germany and Russia becoming closer allies. This originates from the United States and the United Kingdom. The United States and the United Kingdom represent the Atlanticist mindset, while Germany is a continental power which is always neutral or potentially in play. The United States and the United Kingdom traditionally fear Germany moving closer to Russia, and therefore actively engage in subterfuge, sabotage, coercion, and other blackmail operations to control the German political leadership and indeed force them to betray the German people. Comment.
Well, first of all, I know Scott. I've done some interviews with him on his podcasts, and he's a very serious thinker. And what he said in that quote is something that, we've been writing about for many, many years. And this, I just talked about that, the whole question of what is British geopolitics about. It's about preventing any alliance from occurring which fights for the sovereignty of nation states that engage in cooperative development. That was why the Mackinder lecture at the British Royal Geographical Society became the basis of a whole doctrine. Mackinder was just saying what the British elite already thought, which is that the threat at the turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century, going back literally to the 1880s and early 90s when Bismarck carried out an American system-style reform of the German economy. It was then picked up by the French, by the Japanese. And what did it imply? Not just national banking and credit and industrial development and protectionism when it's necessary, but the interconnection. Things like the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, like the Trans-Siberian Railroad project of Sergei Witte, which was sponsored and supported by leading industrialists in France and Germany. This idea of that connectivity was the threat to the British Empire. And people say, well, the British Empire no longer exists. Well, the British Empire has been transformed in recent years from a global colonial power encompassing much of the world as a control of land and countries into a financial empire where those same countries are controlled by the City of London and the offshore islands and tax havens. And so what Scott is reflecting is his own view and his own understanding of the basis of geopolitics. And what he said is absolutely accurate. And I would really encourage people to dig deeper instead of just throwing around the term geopolitics because it sounds cool. Read some of the works of these people. Read what Bertrand Russell had to say. Read the writings of H.G. Wells on these questions. Look at the policies of the British Empire. Look at what Churchill did. The great hero Winston Churchill was an avowed racist who was committed to maintaining the populations of Africa as wage slaves to dig out the raw materials for the British war machine. Look at Cecil Rhodes. Look at the Rhodes Scholarship to recruit Americans to become part of this Anglo-American special relationship. So I applaud Scott for putting that out there, and I think it's very important that we break away from the more simplistic explanations of just the elite are just greedy bastards who want to make all the money they can. Yeah, they are that, but they're more than that. And at the top, they are the kind of avowed racists that we've just been discussing and eugenicists. The fact that, just let me mention one other thing on this. When you look at American policy after Franklin Roosevelt, who was driving the Cold War? Truman was the president, but he was under the direction of Acheson. Acheson, with his ties to the Harriman family, the Bush family, you had a whole crew of people that were Wall Street bankers who went in and, under the direction of Allen Dulles, created the CIA as an assassination bureau, as a regime change coup operation. And they didn't limit themselves to overseas operations, as we can see from what happened with the Kennedy assassination. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the Anglo-American policy.
Harley, you have a question from someone called Crystaliz, who's asking about Prince Harry. He says, now, Prince Harry admitted he was using drugs on duty. So my question is, are these family circles' top leaders frequently using drugs? This might explain why they are so crazy and obsessed with power. That's the question.
Well, remember, Lyndon LaRouche got in a lot of trouble when he said Queen Elizabeth pushes drugs. And I think people know that he wasn't saying the Queen was out in Kensington Square selling dime bags. But we did say she was pushing dope when you see her with a carriage with Prince Charles in it as a baby. But look, the British Empire, what I was just talking about, the transformation from an imperial land-owning power to a financial power, that actually began in the 19th century with the Opium Wars against China. You know, people forget in 1839 and again in 1859, the British fleet was sent to China to put down a rebellion when the Chinese were trying to shut down the opium traffic that the British organized to send opium from the Indian subcontinent to China to cover the costs of what they were importing from China. And the idea on top of that was to create an army of drug addicts inside China. And the Chinese leadership rebelled against it, and the British sent in the Royal Navy. This was Palmerston who oversaw it the second time, the famous Lord Palmerston. So when you look at this, the British Empire as a financial empire, besides the stealing of raw materials and earlier on the slave trade and other things, by the 20th century, it had begun to evolve into a global financial empire. And by the end of World War II, this included drug running operations, gun running operations, money laundering operations, and so on, that were at the heart of this. So, you know, it's not so surprising that if your fortune depends on running drugs, that some of the youth that are benefiting from it will end up on drugs as well. Now, we don't know if everything in Harry's book is true. And I'm just going by the initial reports from the BBC, where they purport to be shocked by some of these revelations. I would simply say they weren't paying much attention to the nature of the royal family. Look at the stories about Prince Andrew with Epstein and so on. So, and also the whole Maxwell clan. So there's a much bigger story here than Harry, and they want you to focus on the soap opera. But the bigger story is that the question is, why do we in the 21st century have a monarchy in the United Kingdom? And to our friends in the United Kingdom, as well as Australia and Canada and New Zealand, which suffer under the same control of the British monarchy, why don't you join the modern world, work with us to spread the real constitutional tradition of the American Revolution, and help us to bring that back in the United States?
I think we have a live question, so I think we're going to go to that next. Is that the case? Yes.
Yeah, hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Sure.
Great. Well, hi, Harley. Happy New Year's, first of all, and it's wonderful to see you. Great way to begin the year. But I wanted to ask a question because I'm reflecting on what Lynn had said in the beginning, that you have this tremendous amount of pessimism in the world, especially among people that, as you were talking about, they know a lot of the problems, and they know what the background is behind this war. But, I think as the ceasefire has shown, there is a potential to actually negotiate a diplomatic solution to end this war, even if it's on the side of Russia. Ukraine might not recognize it, but there is potential. So I wanted to ask you, when organizing people, how do we get beyond this view that there need only be a military solution to end this war? And that we need actually something reflecting what Helga always talks about with the coincidence of opposites, that this is not going to be settled on the battlefield and that we actually need to reach a higher solution to end this crisis.
Well, let me throw out a kind of curveball to you. Have you been watching what's been happening with the Republican leadership fight in the U.S. Congress?
Yeah.
And you have to ask yourself, there was this story out there that McCarthy actually put out there where he said, maybe we won't give Biden a blank check in the future. Now, can you actually see these dysfunctional congressmen standing up against the military-industrial complex as they're constituted at present and denying the funds for the war? I mean, these guys don't even know how to vote for the most part, and they're making these demands that are going to make sure the Congress can do nothing. We've had the so-called do-nothing Congress before, and now we have the do-nothing and know-nothing Congress. But here's the point. The crisis is real. And no matter what these guys in Washington think or the people in Brussels think, the Russian army is not going to collapse and disappear. And Putin is not going to back off his commitment to defend the lives of people in the Donbass and to denazify Ukraine and to keep NATO out of Ukraine. Now, the question is, how do we get the American people over their pessimism? And watching this debate going on in the Congress makes you more pessimistic. Are these the guys we voted for? And they're focusing on this one character from New York, Santos, who they say, well, he was such a big liar. All of these guys are liars. Look at Adam Schiff, who's treated as somewhat of an anti-Trump genius by the media. Adam Schiff he's Schiffless. I mean, he's really the height of mediocrity. So we have to get people to stop being afraid of speaking the truth to power. And kind of you and Jose gave a good example of that when you confronted AOC. A number of our younger organizers who confront Biden, who confronted Obama, and some of the others. This is what we need to do, get an American public, which instead of grumbling at home about how bad things are, goes out in public and organizes people around these higher ideas. And so, as LaRouche said, there's something in the American character which can be accessed provided you go beyond talking points and actually address what's human in another person. I mean, how many people are happy with the idea of sending weapons that are ending up killing Ukrainian soldiers and Russians? Well, we don't have enough money for teachers in the United States. We don't have enough money for food for the families of our service members. We don't have enough money for hospitals. We don't have enough money for roads and bridges and power. And yet we're going into this brave new world of green technology. Most of these ideas are not supported. The polls show that only 1% thought that the issue of Russia and Ukraine was the top issue in the midterm elections. So instead of being afraid to confront people, especially when they're pessimistic, we have to give them examples of what it means to be courageous. And I think you and Jose did that. And many, many more people should start doing that and joining us and watch as we're seeing people step forward, like Ray McGovern. How many people knew what Scott Ritter was doing 2 years ago? But now Scott Ritter is providing another example of someone who's speaking the truth. And so, I think the more people we can engage on these higher ideas, as you mentioned, the coincidence of opposites, get people to start having fun with the idea that the way you challenge hypocrites is point out the ironies involved in their worldview. Most of them, if they really believe what they're saying, could hardly get out of bed in the morning and cross the street. So I think that's the way we fight pessimism.
Okay, great. Here's another question. Here's a question inspired by a friend who's watching. This came in. Given that the situation in the Congress, goes to what you were just talking about, shows us that our government has been reduced to a kangaroo court, what good is a social movement today, given that what really matters is those in power? Shouldn't our efforts be focused on actually changing and doing a complete overhaul of the people in our government at the federal level? Shouldn't we focus our energy on electing one person into a federal position to open the floodgates to start a breakthrough and replacing all of the members in Congress and Senate and inevitably the presidency?
Well, if the person's calling for a candidates movement, that's fine. But the question is, what's the program? What are people going to fight for? And, at this point, I think the discussion around Helga's fundamental principles ought to be the challenge for anyone who seeks office or is running for office. And I think that's the thing that we have to put forward for people who are otherwise looking for some kind of utopian scheme. People will wake up if they see leadership. That's what Lynn said in the interview with the Egyptian journalist. And I think that's really the key, that if there's leadership that's demonstrated, including what we saw from Diane Sayre's campaign, and this was a very courageous step by her to challenge the corrupt election system in New York State, to get on the ballot, and then to fight to have her ideas incorporated in the discussion, even against the media censorship. So, however it happens, the most important thing is spread the ideas, get people thinking to the point where they no longer say, well, I can't take it anymore, I'm going to drop out, I'm going to turn away from it. But instead, get them to reach the point where they say, I'm going to find other people like me who are prepared for a fundamental change. And whether it's the presidential level or the congressional level or the city council level, the more people we get thinking that way, the quicker we'll get that change. Dennis, I just got a message. I have a semi-emergency here that I have to take care of. I can try to get back in a few minutes, but I'm going to have to jump off for the moment.
Okay, well, I think we've recruited another live participant who will now filibuster in your absence. Just let us know when you're back, if you're back.
Okay.
Great.
I'll do that.
Okay, there she is.
Okay. I'll be back if I can.
Okay, very good. So, would you like to say something about who you are and why you're on the screen, other than the fact that we just had Harley jump off?
Well, I'm filling in for Harley today. Well, my name is Anastasia Battle. I'm a LaRouche organizer. I've been organizing for roughly 15 years now, and I like to cause a lot of trouble, which is, I would like that to be my middle name, actually. And I like to encourage other people in our movement, namely you, the audience here, to also cause trouble with us.
All right. So let me ask you a question. You've been monitoring the chat and going back and forth. What's the character of that? What's going on?
Well, there's a number of questions coming in, regarding the peace truce, the Christmas truce. Some people are one person actually commented that they thought that the shutting down of the Orthodox Church was part of the Pope's plan, which I thought was kind of a funny response to have to that. Because in my opinion, the reason why you've got the shutting down of the church in Ukraine is because they don't want to have any kind of truce with Russia whatsoever. I don't think it has to do with the Pope, and that person can elaborate on what they mean and what they're talking about. We can have a discussion about it here live if they'd like to. But some of the other questions that are coming up, people are trying to figure out, why our governments are acting so crazy. This question that came up around the drugs. Do you think it's the drug problem? Do you think it's because our politicians are on drugs? Why won't they let other nations develop? We have someone on here from Africa who is responding directly on that. So it's been a very good dialogue, I think, with many people from around the world, trying to figure out how we can make a breakthrough in the West, in the United States, but also in Europe. What's the cause of these problems?
I have a particular question for you, Anastasia, because I think you've both been involved in this and been following this. We mentioned at the top of the whole broadcast that the tactic that had been used by us around the Dona Nobis Pacem, the singing of it and the involvement of people, contributed certainly to the atmosphere that led to the truce. We were part of a general grouping, kind of a united front of people all over the United States, Europe, some other places that were talking about that. But I think I'd like you to say something about what either kind of transformations you thought that brought about, and also what role something like that has in the politics that we're doing, especially when you talk about people who are looking at the fact, shouldn't we just be concentrating on people in power because we don't really have the power to stop this? And so what's your view of that process? You were in it, participated, and saw some of the results of it.
Yeah, well, I think part of the problem that you have with our own population is that they wait for somebody else to do something for them. There's in the United States, that should be an unnatural thing. It's like the spirit's been beaten out of a lot of people. I think that's the intention behind it, to make them like peasants. In Europe, my sense was that, people have a sense of they've always been peasants, so they don't really, feel like they can act against their leaders or something like that, or yell at them. That was actually a comment that we got when one of our organizers showed a French organizer, us yelling at our political leaders, and they're like, "You can yell at your political leaders? Oh my God!" Which was really, it was telling for me, because that doesn't happen there. And I think the process of doing this Dona Nobis Pacem is actually a way of inspiring the spirit in people. When Lynn, I actually cried a little bit with this clip that you had showed of Lynn talking about that you have to give people something to hope for, a reason to be optimistic. And that's where the fight comes from. When someone can see the potential that could happen if they fight. Otherwise, they do just feel cynical and pessimistic. Or on the other hand, they could just go into a fantasy state and try to ignore everything. Everybody probably knows many people like that who just don't want to think about it. They talk to their therapist, and the therapist is like, "Oh, just tune out politics. It's just a trigger for you." But if we can inspire our people, like with this Dona Nobis Pacem, this classical culture, then you can really dig into the creative powers within yourself and express that to another person and inspire that person. And that becomes very infectious. That's an infectious feeling. That's what I would say about the importance of this process and what we've been able to do with it.
Yeah, I have another question for you, but before I do that, I want to, otherwise I'll forget to do this, is to call attention, because Harley referenced it and I didn't say anything about it, that next week, actually be on Saturday, January 14th, Martin Luther King weekend, we will be doing an event. The Schiller Institute, actually, we are doing an event, and it will begin at 10 a.m., and it's called Resurrect the True Mission of Dr. Martin Luther King, Stop NATO's World War, and Dismantle the JFK International Assassination Bureau. Now, one of the things that is going to do is to talk about the situation of Dr. Martin Luther King and the end of his life, because in the last year of his life, after he gave his famous speech at Riverside Church, April 4th of 1967, he became highly controversial. In fact, he lost basically 2/3, 3/4 of his support, financial support. He was declared by 75% of the population, white population of the United States, 60% of the black population, to be irrelevant. And of course, found himself in other kinds of controversies, accused of inciting violence in Memphis at one point, and ultimately, of course, he was assassinated. The reason that we want to call attention to that is that we believe that it was because of his steadfast stance against the Vietnam War, which at that time was a very unpopular stance to take. Those of us who were alive at that time, as I was, and saw this happen, know very clearly that this was not popular, and it wasn't even necessarily popular among young people. It was popular among some young people that were against the war. One has to remember that at that time, the difference was that 1 out of 8 Americans, 8 American males, was in the draft pool. So when people talk about, well, why aren't we seeing the same kind of mobilization as we saw around Vietnam? One of the reasons is that 12% of the population today is not slated to go to war, and is not slated to go to war in places like Ukraine. It's easy. It's sort of like a video game. You watch it sort of along the lines of what Harry said. And of course, these are human beings. It's not video game characters. But what we want to do on Saturday is call attention to what we're calling the JFK International Assassination Bureau. That when people are saying that JFK was killed by the CIA, if you try that, if you try going after that, you're going to end up at a dead end, because, and I don't mean you shouldn't try to do it because you should be afraid of the CIA. No, I mean because it was not done by CIA in the way that you're thinking of it. It wasn't done by any singular agency. It was done by a combination of agencies. And it was also part of a combination of assassinations involving Italians and French and German and other threats, and Belgian, Congolese threats. Patrice Lumumba, for example, Enrico Monte of Italy, and then others who were assassinated in the aftermath. And so what we're going to be doing next week is, as we say, resurrecting the true mission of Dr. Martin Luther King, and approaching this by allowing people not merely to look at, well, who shot JR, kind of, which is the kind of the old Dallas TV show of the 1980s is what I'm referring to. We've gotten into this habit of being voyeurs, spectators around the concept of real events. No, the idea is what must be done to change this, and how is this process actually coordinated? One of the elements of that is that while it will be something Americans will not like to admit, Americans are the most surveilled, patrolled population in human history, including during the period of Nazi Germany. And they walk around and they talk about their great freedoms and their freedom of speech and the things that they do. But of course, they don't really believe it. They self-police now, partially because of what's been done with social media. But they always self-policed, actually, in the last 50 years. They self-policed at the time of the McCarthy era. And they, if you look at what's happening in the Congress, of course, one of the fringe benefits of what just happened in the last couple of days is that the left-wing progressive so-called social democrats, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Squad, and all those people, were completely exposed as frauds, because instead of fighting as it needed to be done on healthcare or other matters, at the beginning of the Trump administration, they all basically just lay down and took it from particularly Nancy Pelosi and her mafia control of the aisle. So this will be next Saturday, Again, at that time, we will have Ray McGovern as one of these people who will be speaking. Garland Nixon, well-known talk show personality, and others. So I just wanted to make sure that's going to be 10 o'clock next Saturday, and Schiller Institute. So I just wanted to make sure I put that in. The other thing, Anastasia, before I ask you any other questions, is there anything else that we've gotten out in the queue that we need to refer to? If not, I'll go to my question to you.
I was just looking things over. I would just like to say thank you to Jossie, actually, who threw in a donation in the middle of the stream. We really appreciate it. I mean, just other people are just discussing, the situation with the Nazis in Ukraine. We're probably going to get censored for that. So, this video will probably no longer be available on YouTube. But folks would like to talk about the Nazi problem in Ukraine. There's a Nazi problem in Ukraine, and we should definitely talk about it. This is not a side issue or some Russian propaganda. I mean, our organization has been bringing this up long before this ever happened. With the invasion of Russia and all this kind of stuff. I mean, this is real, and these were cultivated after the war, World War II. The Nazis in Ukraine were cultivated and were used by the United States, used by now what we view as the European Union or NATO, in order to create havoc. Right. That's how this stuff works. It's not even about, do we, support Ukraine or not support Ukraine, or do you support Russia or not support Russia? It's these groups are cultivated, these extremist groups are cultivated in order to create these hotspots, right? Just like what you're seeing in Hong Kong, or what you could see in Taiwan, right? What you could see in many other hotspots around the world. Right, that's how geopolitics works. And it's when you don't have the moral conviction with this creative principle that we're talking about here, that you fall for it, that you don't see the big picture and what's really going on. So that's what we have to educate ourselves on. That's what we have to get people to understand, is how do you see the big picture? How do you see the intention of humanity? Where could it be going? As opposed to just reacting to the things that are going on in the moment. That's what I would say to this person bringing up this issue.
All right. Well, I think what we should do at this point is that we don't have Harley back, and we've really sort of covered the topic in any case. If there are no other questions, I'll say a couple of things just by way of summary, and then we have a final musical offering for the day. So just to, we also should announce tomorrow's event, the event that independent candidate Diane Sayre is doing, and we have it up on the screen now, which is good. Sayre in 2024, January 8th, policy discussion webinar. So this is not an event, is not a event about the candidacy. I want to make sure that people are clear about this. This is being done because Diane was interested in the fact that this needed to be discussed. This is an event we cannot live stream. If you want to be part of it, you have to register now on Zoom at this website. Okay, we see it there up on the screen. So keep that in mind. So you're going to have to go to the website and actually register for the event. Helga Zepp-LaRouche will also join Diane for that, as well as a member of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, Steve Starr. So that's for people that want to actually pursue this whole discussion further about the issue of Ukraine, Russia, negotiated settlements, the state of things on the battlefield. All of that will be discussed in detail tomorrow. So I'll just say that much. And I think what we'll do is I want to thank you, Anastasia, for coming on and pinch hitting there for Harley as a little bit of a quick thing, but that was useful, and especially concerning talking about some of the things in the organizing. But I think what we will do is go to our final offering, which is a song, which is performed by the Schiller Institute Ensemble. And it was part of a concert that was done a little bit earlier this year. I think it was June of this year, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a song, Russian, "Shine, Shine, My Star." And it's appropriate for Christmas. You'll see we'll be running the English translation against the singer's performance. And I'll just say before we do that, sort of in summary of where we stand, what we're trying to do with this idea of the 10 principles, and what we're also trying to do from the standpoint of just this kind of discussion that you're involved with, is to resurrect a tradition that built the United States. It's called the town meeting. Of course, this thing is called the Manhattan Town Meeting, but what it refers to is the idea that Americans believed that it was their responsibility to govern themselves. They did not believe that they were supposed to look at opinion polls to govern themselves. And they didn't believe that they had to look at headlines to decide how to govern themselves. And they didn't talk to Hollywood stars because there was no Hollywood. But they didn't talk to people who are on the stage or actors or whatever. All of those things are actually looked down on. That may not have been good, but the American citizen believed, as a result of the nature of the way in which this country came into being, and it is the nature of the way that the country came into being, despite whatever people may say about 1619 and these other things, much of which is also true. But the nature of the way in which you had to bring something into being, which was different than all of that, is that you had to throw off the chains of oppression. And you had to ally with the people that would do that. And the idea that you were going to find people that were going to be perfect expressions of goodness that were going to be your allies was ridiculous. It's never going to happen. There were founders who owned slaves, and there were founders that did not own slaves. There were black founders, and there were white founders. There were Indian founders. There were women founders. There are all sorts of people. So, yeah, but these people are not acknowledged. Why don't you acknowledge them then? And why don't you acknowledge that they succeeded together in creating the United States, as opposed to the so-called narrative, which is simply British history and is only designed to mask for people today the abject failure which is your political life. In other words, most of the people that are complaining about what the United States is not are abject failures in their political life. You have a military budget 10 times the size of the budget at the time of Vietnam. And you have people talking about their rights as whatever it is they claim they have rights for, except they're afraid to talk on Twitter. They're afraid to talk on Facebook. And if they aren't afraid, they should be, because they're being monitored and they're being chastised and they're being railroaded and they're being manipulated. But no, they don't believe that. They say we have a more enlightened, we have a more advanced, we have a non-racist, a non-sexist, a non-something or other view. And therefore, we who care really about what humanity is, we realize that that revolution was no good. That just shows you never read the document. You never read the Declaration of Independence, because the Declaration of Independence would scare the hell out of you. The fact that you're not afraid of the Declaration of Independence shows that you didn't read it. Because what it says is, it is your duty, whenever any government becomes destructive of the ends of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. Now, that does not mean overthrow the state. Why? Because the document itself is the document of the state. The Declaration of Independence is a revolutionary document. It says the only way in which government is allowed to exist, or should be thought of as existent, is that it is a revolutionary process. That doesn't necessarily mean all the things people want to do, like term limits and this other and that other structural thing. You know what the difference is? The revolution is changing your wrong ideas. Changing your wrong ideas about government. Let's take, for example, the idea that people want to argue seriously that this is a free country when you've got the largest prison population anywhere in the world. I mean, then people, they try to lie and say, oh no, there are more people in prison in China. Yeah, but why do you have 3 million people in prison? First of all, there aren't more people in prison in China, but even if there were, it's 4 times the size of the United States. So these things are said often. The Chinese Communist Party, they're the great authoritarians. Yeah, but you have 800 plus military bases and $1 trillion, $858 billion officially in military expenditures, with a large black budget that nobody knows the size of. You spent $8 trillion in Afghanistan, but can't figure out how to spend $8,000 or $800 on on basic sanitation or solving the problem of homelessness or whatever. The way in which the United States and the people of the United States let themselves off the hook, the very idea that people believe out of their arrogance that they represent something more advanced than the founders of the country, is a pathetic indictment of their inability to face the truth. They are small. We are shrunk. We are a little people. And we are little people who are terrified of the people that basically give orders and directives about whom you complain, but you do nothing as you sit and smoke your crack or whatever it is that they give you, whatever the thing is that happens to be what you are given to fix your head, so that you can sit there and smugly believe that your life and the life of the people in the nation has not been turned into a blight on the planet. That's not because of global warming. That's because of global stupidity, globalized stupidity that is being globalized by the American people and the people in the transatlantic sector. Now, a lot of people in the world have said no to that. And those people happen to be coalesced around forces in Russia, in China, but in Brazil now, in South Africa, in other nations. This is something that can be remedied by the American people. But the American people don't have the guts to do it. And the way you know that is that they've lived for 60 years under a dictatorship that has said that their president, John F. Kennedy, was killed by a person working for Central Intelligence Agency, FBI at different points, and other entities as an agent, that the agent killed the president. But that's never even been said that way. It's just said that he's just somebody who went out there and killed him. And then you have situations like Malcolm X, which, of course, now, inch by inch, you are being told that there are police agencies involved in his assassination. And then you have, of course, the other cases of King and of Robert Kennedy. But let's just take a case which is undeniable, the case of Fred Hampton. Everybody knows that the FBI killed Fred Hampton. Nobody has said, nobody's even apologized for that. Nobody's even indicated that that might mean that there were other killings that the FBI did. It's not even thought about. We all know why, because we saw what happened with George Floyd. What actually happened with George Floyd, not the story around what happened with George Floyd, but what actually happened with George Floyd. That what you have is a United States which, because of the cowardice that is characteristic of its population, has lived with the lie that it is a free society for a period of 60 years since the assassination of JFK. The United States could not be a free society. Its people could not be a free society, and it will never be a free society unless that murder is dealt with. Yet it goes around and talks about freedom and democracy and equality all over the world, or equality for genders, equality for turtles, equality for mice, whatever. Whatever it will that will change the topic and fix your head so that you aren't dealing with the cowardice that is your life. Now, this is what must be solved at this time before we end up blowing up the world. It will not come from Russia. The problem comes from here. It will not come from China. The problem comes from here. And it doesn't come from the corridors of power. It comes from you. You know, this is the essential problem of the United States that must be confronted. The people who are in the corridors of power are there because of your omission. And so what needs to happen is that this process of coming to terms with the actually revolutionary conceptions inside of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution so constituted, not the particular laws of the Constitution, the intent. And the intent was to charge you with the responsibility of self-government, a responsibility that this population walks past and walks over every single day. They say, I vote, I'm responsible. What the hell does that mean? Look at what you vote for. You call that responsible? So this is the lesson. This is the confrontation that people need to come to. This is what the Magi did. The three kings did that. The three kings were not Jews. They were not from the area of Judaism. They represented what we call the Gentile world. they traveled because of their sighting of a star that indicated to them that a miracle had occurred of some type. And they went to find that what that was. It was their journey of self-discovery. That's what that is all about. It's not about bowing down to Jesus or something like that, which you'll hear from unfortunate, pathetic fundamentalists that don't understand and don't care to understand the actual mission of Christ. No, it's not about that. It's about the fact that there's something divine in all people, and that divinity, and recognizing the divinity in one another, whatever may be your religion, is the starting point of communication, dialogue, and self-discovery. And so when we look at this issue of peace, the 10 principles of a new security and development architecture, they begin with the exact thing, the sort of actions that President Vladimir Putin took by calling the truce. You say, well, we don't know why he called it, or we believe that since it's Putin, it can't be good. Well, then what does that say about you? How does any redemption ever happen if all are guilty before the fact? Remember, in the course of justice, none of us should see salvation, as Shakespeare pointed out in The Merchant of Venice. The issue is something different. The issue is the coming to terms, the atonement, the coming to the idea of meeting the divinity of all people in oneself by acknowledging the divinity in others. That may take admitting to wrongs, it may take to all sorts of compromises or changes, but it's worth it because it's one humanity pursuing one mission. And that mission is a mission that is revealed to us as a human race. We work to discover the mysteries of space, to discover the mysteries of time, and to discover the mysteries of life together. That's what the idea of Christmas, of Epiphany, and should be the idea of self-government. That's what those ideas represent. What we're going to do is we're going to conclude with this song, which is sung by Michelle Fuchs, who is the soloist, and was performed in June, Schiller Institute, really in the still same spirit of what I just talked about. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and hopefully we'll see in this year something different from the American people, which will make all of humanity proud.